Not every vehicle that rolls off the production line is one of a series. Some of them are completely unique, made to order, and unlike anything else that's ever been built before. Often that uniqueness will be key to the vehicle's value, but other times it becomes a curse. A unique vehicle isn't always a useful one, and so some one-off works become abandoned and forgotten about in favor of more practical models. Each vehicle you're about to see in this video has a story, and we're here to tell it. There are two important things that you should know about the H.L. Hunley. The first is that it's the only surviving example of a Civil War submarine. The second is that it was the first successful submarine in world history. The vessel was built by the Confederate side of the American Civil War, and her success should only be described as partial. She managed to sink a warship, but failed to completely submerge below the water as planned, and then sank before she could return to base. The 40-foot-long submarine was built by Horace Lawson Hunley in Mobile, Alabama, and was launched for the first time in July of 1863. Her final sinking was actually her third. She sank once during a test run a month after she launched, and again in October of the same year. Both times she was salvaged and repaired before being redeployed, but couldn't be saved after the third sinking in February 1864, close to Charleston Harbor. It wasn't until 1970 that underwater archaeologist E. Lee Spence managed to locate the wreck of the submarine, and 30 more years passed before she was raised in August 2000. She's now on display at the Warren Lash Conservation Center, not far from where she was found. Almost 100 years ago, an 1885 V-class locomotive was dumped in New Zealand's Southland River after being declared obsolete. In January 2020, she was hauled back out of the mud and filth of the river and brought back to dry land. One day, the other locomotive that was dumped along with it will be dragged back out of the river too. They were considered to be worthless junk when they were abandoned, but they're now among the last surviving examples of their kind in the world. Under normal circumstances, a train like this would be scrapped when it was no longer useful. But the value of scrap metal was so low in the aftermath of the First World War that it became more practical to sink them in rivers as artificial flood barriers. Getting this one free was no easy task. The vehicle weighs 32 tons, and it had acquired a further 10 tons of silt and mud during its 93 years in the river. For now, the second engine will remain down there because of a lack of funding to retrieve it. But the first has been placed on permanent display in front of the Lumsden Railway Precinct. When a rare and valuable car is found in a barn and made available for sale in the United States of America, or even in most of Europe, it will be sold through a prestigious auction house. In Russia, they do things a little differently. This fully functional Tatra 600 is one of a very rare breed, but it was sold through the internet with no more ceremony than your average chair or table after it was found in Kolomna, close to Moscow, in early 2020. The vehicle is a 1949 model made in Czechoslovakia during the first year of the country's communist era, and is especially rare because it's never been restored or otherwise tampered with. Every element of both the interior and exterior was there when the car was built, including the engine. By 2020, it had spent over 30 years inside its owner's barn, and so he finally decided the time had come to sell it. He was unable to confirm whether the engine still worked, but in theory, there's no reason why it wouldn't. As for the price, $35,000. If you wanted a military vehicle making in the Soviet Union, you turned to the Minsk automotive plant in Belarus. Many of the multi-axle wheeled vehicles made there over the years are still in use by the armies of nations across the world to this day. One of their most unusual creations was the MAZ 7904, a colossal 140-ton, 12-wheel chassis that was made as part of the secretive Selena project. Had the prototype worked out as intended, it's thought that the vehicle would have been mass-produced as a missile carrier. There was no need for vehicles like this to exist before the Cold War, because the missiles they carried didn't exist either. In this case, the necessity of the design was triggered by the invention of the Soviet ICBM RT-23 Stiletto missile, and the carrier was rolled out of the Minsk factory ready for duty in June 1983. At 100 feet long and with 6 axles, it was quite a fearsome sight. Testing on its capabilities was carried out under top-secret conditions after dark, but its problems quickly became obvious. With a pressure of 60 tons placed on each axle, it was simply too heavy to be practical. Having been deemed a failure, it was hauled off to a hangar at the Baikonur Cosmodrome and then abandoned. All of us can probably visualize the shape of a Texaco tanker, but probably not one that looks like this. This is a highly rare Diamond T tanker from 1938, also known as a streamliner tanker truck. And although it was a common sight on roads during the late 1930s and early 1940s, it's thought to be one of the very last examples that survived in one piece, or close to being in one piece to this day. Right now, it's in New Zealand being restored slowly and painstakingly one bit at a time. Not every feature and component of the truck has made it to the 21st century, but it still has its original engine, 4-section fuel tank, transmission, cab, and even the majority of its branding, albeit with a thick coating of rust. It looks a little sorry for itself these days, but when it was in its prime, it was bright red and looked a little more like a fire truck. Sadly, Texaco never thought that their vehicles would become historically interesting, and so they haven't kept any plans or blueprints. So the team working on the restoration of the tanker is having to go off of pictures alone. The Cold War posed new challenges to the military of both the United States of America and the Soviet Union, and those challenges sometimes led to unique solutions. The Soviet M17 Stratosphere, seen here in pieces on the outskirts of the Monimo Museum, was one such solution. During the 1960s, the Soviets were dealing with constant incursions over their airspace by American drifting balloons, carrying out reconnaissance activities. The high altitude reached by the balloons made them hard to intercept and shoot down. And so General Designer Myasishov was ordered to come up with a new kind of high-altitude plane to take care of the problem in 1967. It took them a while. It wasn't until 1982 that the M17 flew for the first time, and even then, it wasn't a total success. An M17 was used to investigate the hole in the ozone layer in 1992, but by that point, it had already been officially retired for 5 years. Even though one of the 2 M17 units that were completed set a world altitude record of 71,620 feet in 1990, neither one of them ever shot down a single balloon. So little was thought of this one that it was simply left to rot in its current location. Not everybody has an enthusiasm for Land Rovers and Range Rovers, but to some people, they're collector's items. That's why there was a lot of excitement when a whole collection of rare and valuable examples of the vehicles was found in Scotland in 2018. The collection includes not just Range Rovers and Land Rovers, but discoveries too, and even a snow track. The oldest of the cars in the makeshift fleet is from the 1950s, and is understood to be a one-off custom build. That isn't the star of the show, though. That honor goes to a 1968 Series 2A Land Rover Lightweight, the first ever built by the company. It's never been registered for road use, so it might even be the prototype. There's also an early Land Rover 110 test vehicle and an SRV1 Rolls-Royce V12 airport vehicle. The owners of the vehicles wanted to retain their anonymity after their collection was discovered by a film crew searching for remote shooting locations, but are said to have been unaware of the potential value of their collection and are now considering offering at least some of the vehicles for sale. If you saw this rusting heap floating by the shoreline of your local town or city, you might not think much of it, but you'd be missing out on a chance to see something special if you ignored it. It's a 2-tower floating transport dock known as A700, part of the LK-85 project, and was built in 1966. It was built in Khabarovsk in Russia, but these days you'll find it decaying slowly and gently in Ossipovsky. The reason why only one of these enormous vessels was ever built is unknown. It looks like it would have been a powerful tool and ideally suited for its task. At nearly 200 feet long and 50 feet wide, and weighing over 650 tons, it was somehow possible for this ship to be fully functional with a crew of only 4 people aboard. As you might expect, almost the entire length of the vessel is given over to the cargo dock. And although it's a little rusty, it still looks like it could perform its duties today if it needed to. Someone would have to do something about the grass that's growing inside it first, though. They say that the site of Goa in India is a place that you can go either to get lost or to find yourself. The oil tanker known as MV River Princess certainly got lost there 20 years ago, and she stayed lost for a long time. The 800-foot-long tanker drifted away from Marmagao port limits during a cyclone in June 2000 and grounded herself on Candolim Beach. As the region depends heavily on tourists arriving on that beach for economic reasons, you'd have presumed that either refloating or otherwise removing the ship would be a big priority for local authorities. But you'd presume wrongly. It took 12 years for demolition operations to commence on the stranded hulk of a ship, and even then, it was done extremely slowly. By that point, its mere presence had done extensive and possibly permanent damage to the coastline. Just by being there, it affected sediment flow around it and directly contributed to coastal erosion. Part of the problem was down to a lack of certification for the ship. It should arguably never have been out on the water in the first place, and so the question of who should pay for its removal raged on for over a decade, while the local area suffered. At least it's gone now. While the tale of the River Princess is a strange one, we at least know what the ship was, and how it came to be stuck on a beach in Goa. The circumstances of the so-called Savio Sir on the banks of the Columbia River in Oregon, USA, are far more mysterious. The strangely shaped vessel looks more like a classic flying saucer than a seafaring ship, which explains how it got its nickname. It's a unique ship, and local stories say that it was made by a unique man called Richard Ensign. Richard was apparently a doomsday believer, and thinking the end of the world was nigh, he made his concrete sailboat at the start of the 1970s to escape the chaos he expected to manifest on the land. The 30-foot, self-righting boat was an impressive creation for one person working alone. Its hulls were filled with foam for buoyancy, and it could be powered by sails or by an engine. The apocalypse never came, though, and the boat eventually became abandoned, eventually floating away during a flood in 1996 and being deposited at its current location by the tides. We're staying in Oregon for a moment because that's also where we'll find the Sumpter Valley Gold Dredge. This gigantic piece of machinery has been proven to be a moneymaker twice in its lifetime. The first instance was during its initial years of operation, when it used its 72 one-ton buckets for ripping gold deposits out of the Powder River. The second instance is right now, because it's enjoying a second lease on life as a tourist attraction. The whole town of Sumpter owes its existence to gold, after deposits were found there in the 1860s. The landscape was hard to work with, and the weather was always cold, but the potential riches made the work worthwhile. There were once 3 dredges working in the river, but this model was built in 1934, using parts of the first 2, and carried on working every hour of every day of every year until 1954. By that point, it had extracted $4 million worth of gold. Adjusting for inflation today, that would be worth $150 million. It was saved from demolition by the National Register of Historic Places in 1971, and now it's preserved as a state heritage area. At what point does a disused and broken former piece of military equipment become reclassified as art? Perhaps you might be able to find the answer to that question by taking a trip to Culebra in Puerto Rico, where you'll find the tanks of Flamenco Beach. These rusty, shattered hulks were once used as target practice by the United States military. But since they were declared to be beyond the point of use even for that purpose, they've become steel canvases for the region's painters and graffiti artists. The use of this area for bombing practice began in 1936 and intensified during the 1960s as pilots trained on targets in the era before being deployed to Vietnam. Unsurprisingly, the natives were never happy with the military presence in the region and protested it for years, finally succeeding in regaining ownership of the land in 1975. As the military saw no value in taking their discarded equipment with them, the locals thought that they'd add a little color to them and make them appear a little more in step with their Caribbean surroundings. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, and you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, and see you soon.